Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Manchester is Red and Talking City podcasts from the Manchester Evening News. Much like the B bosses in Manchester, you wait 125 years for a Derby Day FA Cup final and then two come along at once. Luckily, we didn't use every single possible feature and piece ahead of last year's final. We left plenty of content spare. So there's loads of fresh stuff on the MEN this weekend. That 48-page pullout we've got is well worth it. Make sure you go and buy that as the perfect accompaniment to the big day. And if you want some listening for the big day, then you've stumbled upon the right podcast. I'm Tyrone Marshall in the chair today, and I'm joined, ready for a debate, by Rishi Sunak and Keir. No, sorry, hang on, that's the wrong show. The big debate by our chief Manchester United writer Samuel Luckhurst, our chief Man City writer Simon Bajkowski. You're both looking a little red. I presume that's the temperature from the cup fever you've got, is it?
Just embarrassed by your jokes.
Yeah, I will certainly not be trying to crowbar a general election intro or reference into tomorrow's piece, whatever the final score. I'll have to resist.
I don't believe that, Samuel. There's going to be plenty of general election pieces crowbarred into your pieces over the next few weeks. I think we know you love a good election, but we're here to debate the football and another cup derby. It doesn't. Does it feel like the shine's been taken off by last year's derby? Does it feel not quite as big as last year when we had City going for the treble as well?
I suppose so. I think it felt bigger last year. It felt there was a lot more riding on it. If United had won that final, they'd have had a great season in winning 2 trophies and finishing in the top 4. And also, if they'd have scuppered City's treble, in the end, it turned out to be the greatest season in City's history, and they've gone from strength to strength, really. I mean, it's when you look at their record this calendar year alone, or since they last actually lost a game outright, it's utterly formidable, and you forget just I think everyone knows what a formidable side they are, but sometimes you don't quite know how formidable they are. It's going to be a daunting task for United, and as you said, I think it does feel a bit like we are on repeat. But I thought last year's final, it felt like it was an FA Cup final for the ages. It felt like it was the biggest FA Cup final in decades, really, with the amount that was riding on it. And this season, that's not the case, mainly because United have gone into decline.
Yeah, I mean, we say that, but both teams ended with 2 wins in the final week of the Premier League season. So 2 formed teams heading to Wembley. In the derbies this season, it's a combined score of 6-1 to City. It's 47 shots to 10 to City, 7.7 to 1 on the XG count, I think. So United even got a little bit lucky just losing by that scoreline. Do those games have any impact on what's going to happen at the weekend, do you think? Will City be looking back at those fixtures and thinking, we've got their number this season?
Yeah, I think so. You look at those 2 games and you look at the 38 games, and you've got one very good team who've won the league and one bang average team who've ended 8th. I don't think anybody apart from Erik ten Hag could look at those 2 derbies and think, oh yeah, those were 2 evenly contested games. When even the 2 seasons, really, like City didn't play well in last season's FA Cup final, and United's goal came from a dubious handball. This year, the only goal United have scored against them was a terrific goal, but came from completely out the blue. And that's kind of where United are at. They're sort of, this sort of like 1 in 100 moments that might pay off, but over the course of a season, it definitely doesn't. And over the course of 90 minutes against City, it is very, very unlikely to. So City have to, they have to know what quality United have and, expect the best United, and United returning to, more of the first choice team that Erik ten Hag wants to pick with fewer injuries. But at the same time, it would be a major upset if City lost.
And I mean, how do United stop City, Samuel? Because they've made a pretty poor fist of it this season. I mean, they have been thoroughly outplayed in both derbies, and they can't turn up at Wembley and play like that. So how do they stop City? What can they possibly change in a cup final?
Well, it's convenient they've got their fullest squad for months, and that does say a lot about the mentality of a lot of the players in that team. They're taking, some of them are taking the club for a ride, and fortunately for United, they can actually get rid of one or two of them who, for whom this weekend will be their last game, or in the case of some, maybe out of principle, you don't even take them to Wembley, or they stay in their cup final suit. But ultimately, and conveniently, they're going into this game with pretty much 10 of their 11 best players unavailable. That if Luke Shaw was fit, they'd have their best 11. I think there's going to be a lot of debate in the build up to when the team news is announced as to what the front line is going to consist of, because Ten Hag clearly was experimenting last week with a view to potentially using Bruno Fernandes as the false nine, as he did at the Etihad, which was an enforced tactic because Rasmus Højlund was injured. And when Højlund got injured back in February, he was in his best run of form for United. And Højlund came on and scored in both games last week. And normally when that happens, you think logically, well, if a player's proving a point, coming on in games, getting goals, then they deserve a start. But it's Manchester City in an FA Cup final, and Højlund, frankly, has looked like a boy against men when he's come up against some of these big hitter defenders in recent weeks or recent months, whether it's Virgil van Dijk in the FA Cup and League games against Liverpool, Gabriel and William Saliba against Arsenal the other week. And that would have been on Ten Hag's mind, because when Højlund made his debut against Arsenal, he absolutely unnerved them. He came on and he almost contributed to what would have probably been a winning goal had Alejandro Garnacho not strayed onside. But he certainly gave Gabriel and Saliba a chasing that day in September. But a couple of weeks ago, he was really poor, and there've been some teammates that have had doubts about him, and that there has been a reluctant at times to actually pass him the ball. That's how strange the dichotomy has been, and we've seen it as well. There have been times when Højlund and Rashford have been bickering, and tomorrow you've got this scenario where, in the case of those two players, neither of them may start because of these experiments last week. And I think there is, certainly in the case of Rashford, because of his experience in derbies, and you can make a decision with the heart and the head. He's born in Wythenshawe. He's played in derbies from the academy through to the first team. He's got a pretty good record in big games. He's got a pretty reasonable record in derbies as well. He backed up his words with the goal of his career in March. But also, after he scored that terrific goal, he did kind of fall by the wayside. He had a chance where he mishit it in the first half at the Etihad, and then I think he had a foot race, didn't he, with Kyle Walker that he lost. And I mean, as Sai touched upon, Ten Hag is clutching at straws, going back to those games. Even after that game, he was saying, oh, it's the margins, it's the challenge from Ederson on Garnacho, which was completely fair. But Ten Hag has somewhat successfully, with a demographic of United fans, mainly online, he's programmed them to think that they've been wronged by referees repeatedly this season when they haven't been. Yesterday, he was again banging on about the penalty City got at Old Trafford back in October, which at the time I just thought, it's a penalty. Of course, not every referee is going to give that as a foul. Not every VAR is going to give that as a foul. But that's the fault of the officials in this country and how incompetent and inconsistent they are. But you looked at that objectively, it looked like a foul. It was in the penalty area. It's a penalty. And City won 3-0. It's not as if City hadn't have got that penalty, that they'd have failed to beat United. And what was so impressive about Ten Hag last season, or one of the most impressive things about him, was how constructively critical he was in victory. This season, United have lost a lot of games, and often when they've lost, he's been extremely positive, to the point that a colleague the other week said, after they lost 1-0 very comfortably at home to Arsenal, he said, look, I don't mean to be negative, Eric, but you're being positive after you've just lost the 14th time in the Premier League this season. But given the players that they've got back, and although they have got an issue with no out and out left back, and Varane and Martinez have only started 5 times together this season, and Casemiro has not played in midfield in over a month, I do think they've got it in them to make a fist of it tomorrow, to make it a contest. And it was a contest at the Etihad in March. In fairness, it was level until the 80th minute. United went to pot really after Johnny Evans had to be substituted, and Willie Camboala really looked at his age and looked at his inexperience as he is, and City in the end made it a predictable derby. But United did make a fist of it that day, and they did in the final last year, even though they were outplayed and there was some really rocky periods, particularly the first 30 minutes. They did manage to hang on in there, and they were probably they hit the crossbar, didn't they, in added time, so they almost triggered extra time. But on the day, the scoreline did flatter them.
Yeah, and for City side, it's probably not a case of how do you stop United. The battle for City is to turn up and play as well as they can, and they'll know they'll win this game. But they haven't won a cup final by more than one goal since beating Watford 6-0. They can look a little bit nervy at times in these games, can't they? In Istanbul last year, they were really nervous. They didn't play particularly well in this cup final last year. History beckons again. It's not a treble, but a double-double has never been done before. Is that maybe the biggest threat to City, that they just turn up and they don't play the free-flowing football they can, that they do look nervy and they maybe get dragged into kind of a battle and an ugly game that they don't really want?
Yeah, I think two things that help them will be having gone out of the Champions League final to Real Madrid when they did, and having been pushed all the way by Arsenal in the Premier League, because last year, they were playing every 3 days for so long, and then they won the league with a few games to spare, and they kind of dropped off, and they had maybe 2 weeks where they weren't necessarily on it, and then had to rediscover that form for the cup final and the Champions League. And the cup final, they were scratchy, I would say, because they'd had the time off, and then the Champions League final was probably more nerves, feeling the weight of expectation on them. And whereas this year, they've had sort of the last few weeks where they've had a free run of a week where they've been able to take a few days off at the start of the week, then build up to the game, knowing they have to win because Arsenal have been winning in the league. So this week has kind of been no different for them than, any week for the last month. A double-double is history. It's not as much history as 4 Premier Leagues in a row. I feel like that was the big one. You saw the nerves at Spurs in the final week, a few nerves on the final day, but they got over the line. It is a big achievement to do the double in consecutive years. But like I say, I think like 4 Premier Leagues, that's the sign that's been on the boot room wall all season. That's what they've been gunning for. So, the talk of the FA Cup is kind of like, this is the bonus for our season that would top it off. So I'd be surprised if there were nerves.
Yeah, I mean, Samuel mentioned just before that United can take a bit of heart from last season's cup final. That they did come close to forcing extra time. It was a competitive game. Will City take anything from that game, do you think? Will they look back and think, maybe although we won it, we didn't do ourselves justice? Will they want to produce a better performance? Will they look at that and think that shows how dangerous these games can be, even when you are big favourites?
Yeah, Guardiola kind of always drills in to expect the best of every opponent. And, he has this thing about United, especially United have inflicted quite a few defeats on him, painful defeats, whether that be, Mourinho or Solskjaer. And he knows the weight of United as a football club. And last year was big because United were trying to win the FA Cup to have a successful season, but knew they could have a role in stopping City's treble, which would have been huge. It shows the way this season has gone that City can have the final say on whether United are actually playing European football next year. That will be something that is thought about as well. Because, these players want to maintain their superiority in the city for as long as possible. They want to be as far ahead of United as they can be. And winning the cup final or losing the cup final will make a big difference as to how they're perceived. If they win, they've had an amazing season. United have had a terrible season. If they lose, then they've still had a very good season. But, United can say, well, we won the cup final and we stopped your your double. So there's quite a lot riding on it still.
Yeah. That's all for the first part of this podcast. We'll be back after the break to look at things from a City perspective. Welcome back to the Manchester is Red and Talking City podcast ahead of the FA Cup final. Going to look at things from a City perspective in this section and then go on to United in the second half. I'll ask you both this. You might have different opinions. Samuel, we'll start with you. Do they need to win this final to make this season a success? I know it sounds crazy when they become the first team in English history to win the league title 4 years in a row, but we kind of feel like the league title is a given for City now. If they only win the league title, is that on the par for this City team? Do they need this FA Cup to make this season truly successful?
No, I'd see it as a success for them to have won the title. I mean, they are in that. They're almost kind of at that level United were in the late 90s, early 2000s, when there were a couple of times that they won the league, and it was the mood was quite lugubrious, particularly in 2001, where they'd fallen short in Europe again, and the title had become such a procession. Arsene Wenger was saying it was over in February. And I think it's different with City because although they've won the title 4 years on the spin, they have been taken to the final day on a couple of occasions by Liverpool, which was it's quite dramatic. Following that from the Selhurst Park press box a couple of years ago. This season, I don't feel like it's been a particularly compelling title race, just because that day when Palace won at Anfield and Villa won at Arsenal, there was a shift, and you just sense that nothing was going to stop City at that point. And even if Son Heung-min had taken that chance to get Stefan Ortega, there was still about 13 minutes on the clock for City to get a goal, and you'd have backed them to have got a goal, as crestfallen as they'd have felt at that point. And I know it's easy for Guardiola to say, Stefan Ortega has saved us the league, but Pep Guardiola is he's prone to a bit of theatrics coming from Barcelona. So although they won 3 trophies last year, and they could, I don't think they will end up with 1 trophy this year. It's not a come down, and also it's the feat of doing it 4 years on the spin. And I know that there's an integrity issue to address there, that it's taken the Premier League an inordinate period of time, and that will, I suspect, this time next year we'll have an idea whether City are playing at Rochdale next season or able to contest another Manchester derby. But that's a story for another day. And as far as the actual football brilliance is concerned of the players and the coach, it's best in class, whether it's the innovation of transforming Josko Gvardiol into a left back and then into a left winger, or still getting a tune out of Kevin De Bruyne, who at times has looked like a player in decline, really, or Erling Haaland being top scorer when there was some pretty daft punditry comments about him having the standard of a League Two player. This City team still continues to evolve, and it has done that, regardless of the amount of trophies they've got this season. And United would absolutely kill to just be title winners in a season. That's how far they've fallen, and that's how high the bar's been raised by City. I think they've had a great season regardless, but it could be a truly great season to win 2 doubles on the spin. I don't think an English club has done that, have they? I don't think they've won 2 successive domestic doubles of league and FA Cup.
So I mean, you've kind of been around the camp, I guess, in terms of speaking to players and Guardiola. Do you sense that the title is enough and that the FA Cup final is a welcome bonus, or will they feel they need this to make it a really successful season?
I don't think they need it, but Guardiola didn't need to stick around for 8 years. He didn't need to win 4 Premier Leagues in a row. He didn't need to do anything, and that is kind of the mentality in the squad. They don't need to put Kevin De Bruyne and Erling Haaland out at Luton Town in the 4th round of the FA Cup, but they do it because they're addicted to winning. And I think I remember when they lost the league title to Liverpool having won. I think they were the first team in a decade after United to win back-to-back, but then they lost the third year to Liverpool. And I think it was Roy Keane who was like, oh, winning 3 in a row is not for everyone. And, you know, you can say that from a position of strength. City are now in a position where they can say winning 4 in a row is not for everyone whenever anyone wins 3 titles and doesn't win the 4th. Like that achievement may last years and years and years. And that is what they're kind of in the game for. But I think there's also a kind of an acknowledgement within the players that they won't recognize what they've done until much later in their careers. You know, there's certainly a reputational aspect for the whole team from outside of the club, while the charges hang over to say just how are these titles going to be remembered. But even inside the club, the players are kind of they're too focused on the present to be able to really look back and think about what they've achieved. So they're just kind of, you know, tunnel vision going forward and trying to win as many trophies as possible.
Yeah, I mean, these landmarks kind of fly under the radar a little bit with City for reasons you've mentioned there. But I mean, the 4 in a row is a phenomenal achievement, and the back-to-back doubles. As much as we kind of had 2 days of back-to-back treble talk in March, achieving the double-double would be another major historic achievement for this club, wouldn't it? It feels like it's barely been mentioned in the build-up to this final, but it is a lot that's on the line for them.
It's difficult to make a song around it, isn't it? I don't really think it's going to be around the terraces quite like 4 in a row will be. But yeah, it is. And then, you know, the other thing is that sort of, you know, as successful as City are, and as sort of, you know, as up in the air as their achievements are because of the charges, you know, we've got this long wait while you say, right, well, do you want to sort of take away from the achievement of this side because of something that was done before most of this side were put together? You've also got United and lots of other clubs saying, yeah, we really like what you've done so much that we're going to take your staff and we're going to take your ideas. And, you know, we want your model to become our model. So there's kind of a lot of ways in which City's success can be seen. And while there are plenty of people sort of questioning while you know, there may well be Premier League clubs questioning the legitimacy of it, there are also Premier League clubs trying to take what City have done and recreate it for themselves.
Indeed, one just across town. And Samuel, when you look at that City squad, when you look at that team they're likely to put out tomorrow, I mean, apart from all of them, who do United have to keep a special eye on? Who's kind of the most dangerous player or players to United in terms of how this final is probably going to pan
out? Jesus. I mean, as you said, where do you start? The way they've... I think what Guardiola's done with the defence over the last year or so has been pretty pioneering, especially Guardiola. You look at Guardiola's background and how good he was at the World Cup, and the profile of defender he is, and his frame, and it's the classic Eastern European centre back. Yet now he's playing like a fluid winger, and that is going to have a bearing on what United do with their selection, because Ahmad has started the last few games and he's done very well. But do you really want to pit him against that guy, because that guy is probably going to be doing more attacking than Ahmad is going to be? And I mean, Rodri, I think is a terrific player. I know that's not a revelatory statement whatsoever, but United have got to try and find a way of disturbing him, because he's so integral to what City do, and he scores really important goals. It's whoever you try and keep in check, there's somebody else over your shoulder. I think I remember when I was in the MEN office when we got tipped that Bernardo Silva had just touched down from on an EasyJet flight. And I was thinking, he's signing for one of the clubs, and then it soon transpired he was signing for City. I just wondered at the time, having watched him for Monaco, why the hell were United not in for him? And I absolutely loved watching David Silva. I think Bernardo Silva is on a par with him. If David Silva has a statue outside the Etihad, then Bernardo Silva should have one. As much as he agitates somewhat to leave every year, it feels like he continues just to be brilliant every year as well. I mean, Haaland in last year's final wasn't much of a nuisance, yet inside 10 seconds, there's a flicker of hesitation about Lindelof letting the ball bounce. And even though he technically won the duel, all he did was just allow the ball to drop to Ilkay Gundogan, and United's game plan went out the window. I think if they don't concede within 13 seconds, and they'll be doing better than last year. But what really harmed them last year, although they did claw it back and equalise, and they actually ended the first half quite strongly, Varane had a pretty decent opportunity to put them 2-1 ahead. But ultimately, the game plan went out the window, and the mindset completely changes. You are effectively starting the game 1-0 down. They somehow came through that first 30 minutes, survived, got a pretty fortuitous penalty, and the game changed there, and United were probably the more bullish team at halftime. So strange things can happen in football, but they are going to have to be extremely compact, and they've not been compact this season. It was surreal, the Arsenal game the other week, because there was an argument to say it was one of United's better performances this season. They were utterly harmless. David Ray, I don't think is the most convincing of goalkeepers, but the two saves he had to make from the 2 attempts on target, I can't even remember if they were proper saves. They might have been catches rather than saves. But United were compact, and they conceded a dreadful goal through Casemiro's laziness and Wan-Bissaka being a bit dozy. But by and large, they reduced Arsenal to more speculative efforts, and Arsenal always had another gear in them to go, but Arsenal were also affected by nerves of the occasion, as it was the penultimate week of the season, and it was the first time they were actually challenging for the title in the penultimate week of the season in probably 20 odd years. And of course, this weekend there are going to be an element of nerves on both sides, and maybe that can affect City, but there's a lot United have to be worried about, and City have this luxury. I mean, Ten Hag's used that word luxury in terms of options he has from his squad this week in terms of selections, but his team will be picked. The way he picks his team, I think it will be pretty much dictated by what City have and how City set up. Whereas City know they can just play whoever they want, and they will back themselves to beat whoever they come up against.
Yeah, and one player Samuel didn't mention there, almost as if he's read the script because I wanted to go on and talk about him, is Phil Foden. I mean, it's been Foden's season, hasn't it? Not just for City, probably in the Premier League as a whole. Guardiola calling him the best player in the Premier League now. I'm not sure too many people would disagree with that. The way he's played and delivered at times this season, it would be no surprise if he turned up and scored or influenced this game in a big way, would it?
No, loves a derby. Has not played as many derbies as he should have done, really. There's been quite a few years of, will Guardiola pick him? No. Why not? And, obviously nobody can question the way Guardiola has handled Foden now because of everything that he's achieved. But you still kind of think he could have had an impact in more games if he was trusted in them. But a hat-trick last season against them, and a match-winning performance against them this year, and a number of match-winning performances for City, and that has been the difference this year, because Rodri's been City's best player and Guardiola's been amazing in the running, but Foden and Haaland scored most of the goals, but Foden has been the one that has stepped up and taken responsibility, and we saw that so perfectly with the West Ham game on Sunday, where there could have been nerves, and then Foden scored inside 2 minutes and then inside 20 minutes to sort of give City an unassailable lead, really. And, he has been, just before they left for the Club World Cup in December, it was his mistake playing in the middle that cost City 2 points and meant they'd won 1 in 6 in the league. And, Guardiola wasn't too happy with him at all. And, not that he was playing badly before then and not doing things before then, but ever since then, especially when De Bruyne and Haaland were out in January, Foden was the one who stepped up and said, I am going to do this for my team. And yeah, I think he will want to. He obviously, he's in this weird position where he's been the best player in the league and still doesn't have sort of an assigned place for the summer in the Euros. Everyone thinks that Southgate should put him in the 11, but nobody's quite sure where to put him because he's never really clicked in an England shirt. So he still has plenty to prove, and I think he will be looking to make a mark.
And you both mentioned it, so let's just touch on the charges as well. Samuel, from you speak to plenty of United fans, is there a sense that they sort of let City's success wash over them because of these charges and because of kind of the way it's viewed as to how City have achieved that success? Does it maybe not hurt as much as it might have done or as much as it would have done when Liverpool won the league a few years ago, for example? Do you kind of get that sense from United fans?
Yeah, there's definitely an element to that. You go back to the final day or that running in 2014 or 2022, and United supporters was effectively celebrating City win the title because it meant Liverpool weren't going to win the title. I think Liverpool will always be United's biggest rivals. The most toxic rivalry United have is not with Liverpool or City, but it's with Leeds. You only had to be at Ellen Road last season it was the vitriol that poured down on that day from the home section and the away section. It was the first time that I'd heard the Munich chant aired that loudly, and of course United fans retaliated with chants about Istanbul. So you don't get that toxicity between the Manchester clubs, and it obviously has crossed that line a few times with Liverpool. But certainly, I think where Liverpool had gone so long without winning the title, that was anathema to United fans, the prospect of Liverpool winning it. And in the end, it was probably about the most palatable way Liverpool could win the title, and that the stadium was empty, it was locked down, it was a pretty sterile atmosphere. It could have been a complete carnival. It would have been, in 2014, of course, nobody, probably even in early February still, had Liverpool down as title challengers, and it was so unexpected. And United fans were obviously reeling from the Moyes era as well, that it seemed like it was about to be compounded by Liverpool also winning their first title in 24 years. The one that obviously would have given United fans sleepless nights was in 2012 and the manner of it, because City, frankly, they won that title in a very United way, scoring two goals in added time. The parallels were very, very eerie, and since then, I think some of the successes they have, United fans have allowed them to. It's helped that United have been so distant as well. Even when City won it the first season under Guardiola in 2018, United came second, but they were a very distant second. The title was won in April with about 4 games to spare, I think it was. And thanks to Der Spiegel and other others out there, doing their research and unearthing certain revelations, and of course the UEFA charges in 2020. I mean, I remember being in a lift with Ed Woodward in Turin at the time the Der Spiegel stuff had kicked off, and he said, "Oh, it's been an interesting week, hasn't it?" Like talking about, essentially referring to that without even mentioning it. And as someone at United said last year after the Premier League announced their charges, mud sticks. So, I mean, City are obviously clearly fighting these charges tooth and nail. But I think it does certainly, although it doesn't for City, and I think City supporters are clearly going to almost revel in this infamy. For United supporters, it does certainly, it does ease the pain of United being, frankly, a non-entity of a club, to the point that they're now finishing 8th in the Premier League table, while City are the most dominant team in English football since United under Ferguson.
Yeah, mud sticks apart from to that executive we've hired from Manchester City during that period.
yeah. Make an allowance for him. Yeah,
we'll let him off. He probably knew nothing. So if other fans say they don't care, it's illegitimate, there's an asterisk next to it or whatever, are City bothered? Does City care about that?
I think the squad care. I think the fans care, but not as much as the fans from rival clubs who are saying that they don't care. There's been like a real drive to be like, nobody cares about City winning. And like, even this week, the stuff about, more people watch Klopp's departure than City winning the title. And it's like, no, more people watch the City game. They just tuned out rather than like watch a bunch of men lift a trophy. But, mud sticks. We all await to find out the conclusion of the charges. I sort of think the hearing isn't going to make any difference because everyone's already made up their minds. But the charges really are just kind of, for me, a continuation of sports washing. There are kind of legitimate questions to be answered, but it's also just been used as a cop-out by other clubs and other fans for so long. How can we compete with City? How can you compete with a state back in City? And it's like, well, actually, we've got financial restrictions, and like United a few years ago boasting about how they had the record spend in the division. They've spent huge amounts of money, but they've spent it badly. They spent it much worse than City. And they say, we didn't win the league. Never mind. How can you compete with City? And you say, spend your money better. And the charges, again, there's sort of an acceptance of, we can't compete because they've probably cheated. So how can we compete with that cheating? And it's like, right, well, if you want to say, right, we don't need to get better because like we don't agree with what they're doing, then the gap is only going to get further. Like, on a sort of related but separate note, every time you hear Erik ten Hag talk about how close they are to City, you just kind of think this is music to City ears, because if he genuinely believes this, then the longer Erik ten Hag is in his role as Manchester United manager, the bigger the gap will grow. So, there are these things hanging over City, but at the same time, the more clubs kind of just use it to sort of dilute the success and say that that's the only reason for their success, the more City will enjoy it because the more trophies they'll win in the meantime.
Yeah. Good stuff. Right. That's all for part 2. We'll be back after the break to look at the United side of things. Welcome back to the Manchester is Red and Talking City podcast, previewing the FA Cup final. Manchester United, then, Samuel, 8th place in the league. No European football unless they win this cup final. I mean, the big incentive here is obviously to win the FA Cup and to beat Manchester City. In terms of the European side of things, I mean, it would be embarrassing for the club not to have European football next season, but then it's embarrassing to finish 8th in the league in the first place. And financially, I mean, even if it's the Europa League, they kind of need to get into Europe in a way, don't they? There's a lot riding on this game for them beyond just the cup final, given we know how difficult things are for them at the moment with those financial rules that are in place.
Well, there's a danger that another circle could close here, in that 10 years ago they finished 7th and didn't qualify for Europe and hired a Dutch manager in the summer. On this occasion, it could be finishing outside the European places, not qualifying for Europe, and a Dutch manager going this summer. It's such a strange, and it's so different, even though it doesn't feel that long ago, 10 years ago. But the way United approached that summer was, right, we need to just chuck money at the problem. So they embarked on a record spending spree of 152 million pounds they paid for 6 players, because they had to pay 6 million for the Falcao loan fee, which was of course, money well spent. I think he got 4 goals, didn't he? 6 million for 4 goals. And they just, in terms of the sales that summer, there was a mass cull of the squad. So many players went, but it was like, just get rid of him. Doesn't matter how much we get for him, because they could back then. But the goalposts it's not so much the goalposts have changed. They've been relocated elsewhere. It's in a different sphere altogether. And that's why pretty much everyone in the squad this summer has a price. And they need to clear out the squad anyway, because they finished 8th. They went out of Europe altogether by finishing bottom of their Champions League group in December. Their defence of the League Cup ended at the second hurdle with a 3-0 home humbling. And the FA Cup run, fortunately for them, has allowed them to, given them the opportunity to salvage this season. If they were to win the FA Cup this week, I still don't think it would be a successful season, because they finished 8th, and you have to judge a team's progress or lack of progress on their league form. It's 38 games over a 9-month period. And as the cliche goes, the table doesn't lie. United are the 8th best team in the league. They finished 31 points behind City. Points wise, I think until the last couple of games of the season, they were closer to Luton, who of course were relegated, than they were to City or Arsenal. It would have been at that point, who were top of the league. And Ratcliffe stressed the importance of getting into Europe back in February. I think it was specifically the importance of getting into the Champions League, and that was not going to happen some time ago officially. And I think we all knew maybe 2 months ago that it wasn't going to happen. And the fact that they are in this, they're in this situation where they need to win a cup final just to qualify in Europe. It's a throwback to United in the 70s or the 80s, when they were never, ever in the running for the title. And we all know that they've never, ever been in the running for the title since they last won it in 2013. That is how far they've regressed. They've gone so far backwards. They are starting to resemble the United team of the 70s, although I'm sure supporters of a certain vintage would be affronted by that comparison, because there was more to get behind with the teams under Tommy Docherty and then Ron Atkinson. And when they did win a few FA Cup finals, or I think between 76 and 85, they got to 5 FA Cup finals, and that's what they were back then. They were a cup team. But for the sheer amount they've spent under the incumbent manager, who's had unprecedented backing, as his permanent predecessor had unprecedented backing, they've spent more than £400 million. And before this squad rebuild has been completed, they need to tear it down and commence a new rebuild. And does a manager get to oversee that when he's just overseen this pretty dreadful season? I suspect he won't, but that's the other fascinating. I mean, it's not a subplot; it's probably the main plot of the weekend. What happens with the manager, because they are going to have to communicate that within. We're speaking on nearly 11 a.m. on Friday morning. They need to communicate that within the next 60 hours at the latest, you would say.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll come on to the future of Ten Hag a little bit as well. First of all, just looking at the team. I mean, we said after that Palace game that you could see United not winning another league game all season. And in the end, they won 2. And I think we were both surprised that they managed to beat Newcastle and Brighton. I mean, I was at City on the final day, but it sounded like Brighton was a little unconvincing, at least first half. But it was two of their better wins this season. And they did it without playing a striker, essentially, with playing Fernandes as a false 9, although Højlund had an impact off the bench in both games. I mean, it's given them a bit of confidence going into the cup final, but has it also given them a game plan? Do you think he'll go in again with that plan of playing Fernandes as a false 9, or has Højlund done enough to maybe lead the line?
Well, that experiment worked against Newcastle and it didn't against Brighton, and Ten Hag gave up on it after an hour. He decided to take Fernandes off and save him for the final. They'd have got in at half time and seen that Newcastle were 3-0 up. So at that point, any notion of obtaining a European qualifying place kind of went out the window, even though Brentford got it back to 3-2, and it was just all about let's get players on, get in minutes, let's rest players for the game against City. So, I mean, unless they win, it almost feels as if he's damned he's damned either way, because there are arguments for both sides of it in terms of, do they go with the striker, do they not? If they weren't to go with Højlund, it would be probably Fernandes as the false nine with McTominay behind him, Ahmad on the right and Garnacho on the left. Is that going to unnerve City in any way? I have my doubts, and Ten Hag is clutching when he keeps on harking on back to this game at the Etihad. Nobody, I mean, we don't. Maybe he does, but we don't forget the chance Haaland had in the first half when somehow he cushioned it over the bar when he was about a yard out, and City had some other pretty good chances that first half. They took probably 49, 50 minutes to get going, and it was through that virtuoso goal from Foden. And I don't think United can rely. I think it would be really misguided for United or Ten Hag to look back on a game that was 2.5 months ago and think, yeah, that should be our game plan, when they lost that day as well. Because last season they won at Old Trafford, and he did try and replicate that game plan in the cup final. You thought, fair enough. We all knew that Fernandes was going to be on the right that day, especially as Antony was out injured. And in the end, that didn't work, because the real problem was that Eriksen, I think, was playing as the number 10, wasn't he? And he was just completely anonymous. He's had his worst games, or some of his worst games for United, playing behind the striker. And this weekend, he'd probably be lucky to even make the bench. I suspect he will, but he doesn't even come into the reckoning. And as I said earlier, Ahmad, are you going to pit him against Vardiol? That would be a bold call. It would be an adventurous move. But I still think there's just a case for Rashford, because although it looks illogical from the outset, and he's not started since he was booed by fans and when he came off in the FA Cup semi-final against Coventry, they did get a reaction from him at the Etihad in March, and a few days before that he gave his verbal dissertation to the Players' Tribune, and he thought, okay, you need to back up your 2,000 words here, and he did with one of the goals of the season. So I think there's logic in leaning on that. And also, he has, as I said, he's got 9 or 10 of his best players available to play against City. Why would you weaken yourselves? And they are going to have some reasonable game changers to bring on. If I'm a United fan at Wembley tomorrow, I'd rather have McTominay on the bench to throw on, knowing that there's a good chance United will need a goal in the final 10 or 15 minutes, given that he scored 5 goals off the bench this season. Because he's got plenty of good attributes, but ultimately, when he's on the pitch as a starter, if he's not scoring or tackling, there's not a lot that he's doing, because he's quite a technically limited player compared to the other options United have to play. And if City have got Kevin De Bruyne as their playmaker behind Haaland, or De Bruyne and Bernardo Silva, and you're shunting Fernandes out wide right, and I know he can have an effect from pretty much wherever he plays, I still think this is an occasion where you've just got to play Fernandes back in his strongest role. But the caveat there is that in the 5 derbies Ten Hag has managed, he's only played Fernandes once as the number 10. And it was when United was 6-1 down with 80 minutes on the clock in the Etihad derby last season. And that game has had a big bearing on how he's managed United in general, but particularly in derbies. He didn't start Casemiro that day. It was McTominay and Eriksen. He tried to go toe-to-toe with City, and it was completely the wrong way of going about it. I think at that point, Casemiro had still not made his full league debut, and he was easing him in, and he was taking too long to ease him in. But Casemiro is definitely going to start tomorrow with Mainu. Looking at that team tomorrow, it feels like there are 8 nailed-on certainties to start, which are Onana, Dalot, Martinez, Wan-Bissaka, Mainu, Casemiro, Fernandes, Garnacho. And then you've got 3 that you're uncertain about. My gut feeling is it will be Varane with Martinez, because it just has to be. I think he's on his day, he's the best option to partner Martinez with. It will be his final game. He's got ample experience of playing. He's playing the biggest finals in football. And then the other 2, it's who are those forwards going to be, or are they going to be two forwards? Is it going to be? Is he going to play a striker in Højlund, or is he going to try the false nine experiment, which they've had mixed success with across these 3 games with Fernandes? They lost to City, they beat Newcastle, they won against Brighton, but they got the goals after Fernandes came off, and it was quite amused that Ten Hag mistakenly said, when he was asked about Højlund's impact last week, he said, "Oh, he came on after we scored." He didn't. It was 0-0 when he came on, and if he wasn't there, that long ball from Casemiro, where Højlund's presence seemed to unnerve the Brighton centre back, that goal probably doesn't happen because the Brighton defender had a striker to occupy, and then it runs through to Dalot. So you can overthink this, and Ten Hag could toss and turn over it for as long as he could be still doing that now. But I think it'd have been in his interests to have settled on this team at the start of the week, so he could coach the players to within an inch of their lives, so that they have the routines and they're ready for tomorrow. And I suspect he has done that.
Yeah. Si, what would worry City the most? I mean, from a City perspective, United's success against City has come almost always on the break in recent games. So you would think a front 3 of Rashford, Garnacho, Højlund would cause them problems. Would they fear that more than Fernandes playing at a false 9? I mean, it feels like they would handle Fernandes relatively easily in that position.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing they'd fear would be a new manager in charge of United. Yeah, the pace. United have had success against City by using pace and using the counter-attack and using tricky players and Garnacho, and I do think Højlund would be able to, cause them some. I think Højlund would cause them more problems than Fernandes as a false 9 would, just because they're so used to playing against different systems and things like that. They have played with a false 9 for years and 2 false 9s, and they kind of are accustomed to that kind of thinking. So I don't think it would catch them out in the way that it might catch others out. As difficult a season as he's had, Rashford showed at the Etihad what he can bring, even if he did have a few other chances that he could have taken that day. So, I think I don't think it is going to be a case of United outplaying City on the day. I think if United are going to win, it's going to be a case of them executing a game plan perfectly by scoring with the few chances they create and keeping City out at the back. So, you've got to ask yourself, who are the players most likely to score or create a goal? And that probably comes down more on, Fernandes, Rashford, Højlund and Garnacho more than it does kind of maybe going down the set piece route of McTominay and Casemiro and others.
Yeah. Last but not least then, Ten Hag's future. Now, we'll come to you first, and I'm getting the impression from a couple of things you've said on this podcast that you don't particularly rate him this season and think it might be time for a change at Old Trafford.
It depends on whether what he says publicly is the same as what he thinks privately, because, I'm not close to the situation at all. But whenever I see what he says in press conferences and, see him still banging on about, this marginal call at Arsenal in September was the reason our season tanked, you sort of think, maybe just take a bit of responsibility, mate. It's a very interesting situation where back in 2016, we had a manager who won the FA Cup for Manchester United, and I think they were level on points with City, but finished outside the top 4 on goal difference. That was deemed unacceptable by a sort of ownership who were largely seen as not being able to make good football decisions. Now, Manchester United have a group of people in charge of football operations who we are expected to believe are good at making football decisions. You've got a manager that's finished 8th, 31 points behind City. It seems pretty, and with no apparent style or anything like that, it seems pretty inconceivable that he could lose the FA Cup and not win a trophy and remain in his position next year. But maybe there are some galaxy brains out there who, you know, are beyond my comprehension.
Yes. Samuel, then, final word on Ten Hag from yourself. Like we say, the 48 hours probably after the cup final are going to be pretty instructive. I mean, United still seem to be insisting that no decision has been made, but it can't be the case that no decision has been made and that the cup final isn't instructive one way or the other. Even you've already made the decision, or you're making the decision based on what you see in the cup final, because as we're seeing, other clubs are lining up managers now, and if they are going to make a change, they need to get their ducks in a row pretty quickly.
Yeah, and they've been assessing candidates for months, and clearly they're doing a pretty good job of keeping it under lock and key in terms of the decision. I suspect they have made it, because if they haven't made it, they shouldn't be running a football club. As we've discussed before, and as you've just said, you've got to have your ducks lined up in a row. If you're waiting on the outcome of an FA Cup final, a one-off game where there have been shocks in the past, to decide whether a manager should stay or go, you shouldn't be running a football club. And I don't get the impression from Ineos that that's how they go about things, and the way they've tried to hit the ground running at United and change things, and they are upsetting the apple cart a little bit and trying to do things very differently from the previous regime. So as far as the manager is concerned, it's the biggest decision they're going to have to make yet, but they have to make it this weekend, and they have to be swift. And of course, they will want to avoid a repeat of what happened in 2016, when somebody told someone at the BBC to push a button, and when the BBC do that kind of story, it has a different. There's a different dynamic with it, because the BBC seldom do stories as concrete and as I mean, they said it was absolutely going to happen, which we all knew it was going to happen, but the BBC seldom do stories like that. So it did take it on. It did cause a frenzy. At the time, it felt like United winning the FA Cup was inconsequential, because the guy who was about to come into the press conference room parading the trophy was not going to be there for much longer, and Jose Mourinho was coming in, and that's exactly what happened. So they will want to avoid a repeat of that. And I think for our own sanity on Saturday, I hope that's the case. I'd much rather that there's some breathing space, and that we just have to log on Sunday and do everything that we have to do. But anything can happen with United. It feels like it's the club where anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Ultimately, if Erik ten Hag knew he was staying, they would have told him by now, and they would have communicated that to us and to the supporters, and they've not done that. And that's always led me to think that there will be a managerial change, and also the fact that they are assessing candidates, and they've been doing that for some time now, and they are contacting the representatives of possible replacements. And beyond that, this argument that there has been that, there's not an outstanding candidate out there. There's Tuchel who's available. There is Pochettino who's available. There's a lot of momentum behind Kieran McKenna now. There are other managers who I don't think are suited to United, but they're unattached as well. They have so many options, and the notion that none of these guys can improve a team that have just finished 8th in the Premier League, I think, is nonsense. And you only have to look at how bad this season has been at United, and the fact that the manager who talked such a good game last season, when he was actually critical of the team when they won games, and he's now very, very positive about the team whenever they lose, it feels like, with the odd exception. It's a very simple decision. And the comparison with Chelsea a couple of years ago is relevant. When Chelsea had new decision makers with Clearlake after their takeover, the structure changed. Everyone was pretty much cleared out, new technical directors, new brains trusts and what have you. But the manager stayed because Chelsea had got to 2 domestic cup finals, lost both of them on penalties in penalty shootouts to Liverpool, who at that time, I think they hadn't lost a game in 2022. The only game they lost in the run-in was the Champions League final. Chelsea also finished in the top 4, so the manager was safe as houses. Yet in September, he was still sacked because his face didn't fit, because it's a new regime. And what happens when new regimes come in? there are new faces and the old faces go. And with United, the chief exec has gone, the football director has gone. It is a very easy decision to dispatch of the manager when he's just overseen the season that they've had.
Absolutely. That's a good way to end, I think. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Please leave us a like, a review, and subscribe to Manchester is Red or Talking City, or both, indeed, if you just love Manchester football and don't have an allegiance either way. Samuel, Simon, thank you for your time, and I'll see you on Wembley Way tomorrow.